Welcome, everybody. Today we are talking about Capital Chapter 3, which is titled Money or the Circulation of Commodities. Where we left off on last time was Marx talking about the process of exchange, which led to a universal equivalent, which is a commodity that can be used to buy other commodities. And that universal equivalent took the form of money. So Chapter 3 is all about the money form. Money plays two main roles that he breaks down. First is as a measure of value, which represents socially necessary labor time. And the second role it plays is in the process of exchange, which makes the process of exchange easier by moving commodities around. And so as the theme of capital and Marx's dialectic, those roles can be contradictory, i.e., gold is an inefficient means of circulation, even though it's an excellent measure of value. So like imagine going to the grocery store and having to pick out little pieces and bits of gold to pay for an item. So chapter 3 is then split up into 3 sections. The first section is money as a measure of value, as I stated. Section 2 is money as a means of exchange. And then section 3, he kind of combines those two aforementioned roles and talks about money in general. Anything, Steve?
Yeah, so like I found it funny that you said, imagine like walking around with like some gold bullion and then just having to chip it off or something like that would be pretty ridiculous in the market. So
and then the markets would need like little scales or something like that.
Right. Which I think is how a lot of markets started. You know, in the sense of like I kind of imagine like watching like old Renaissance films where you can kind of see like those two little scales where people had like a piece of metal or something on one end and then like goods on the other.
Right.
You could kind of see like how that kind of get there. But no.
Before we get too into it, I know you read up a little bit on like the actual history of money, and I just wanted to point out that Marx doesn't really talk about the historical formation of money. He kind of talks about how money is like materially used, I guess you could say. So if you want to just give a little bit of historical context to how money formed before we jump into the chapter.
Right. I mean, I think I actually talked about that in our first video, but just like a quick recap for people, since this kind of video deals exclusively in money. Like you said, the historical theory, at least behind, or hypothesis about the creation of money, at least what my information comes from David Graeber's work, the American anthropologist who sadly did pass away last year. He primarily in his work, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, talks about the formation of money in relation to military conquest, primarily as a form of supporting armies out in conquering land. So I like I said in the first video, I kind of go into a lot of detail, but to talk about it succinctly, he basically says armies would go out to some distant land. These armies would somehow need to be fed and clothed and given goods and services, essentially. So the way that empires and emperors came up with to make that happen was that they would force the populace that they conquered into paying a tax. And the most efficient way to do that is by basically minting coins and then paying the coins as wages to the soldiers. And then the soldiers would exchange those coins to the local populace, who would take it in the form of exchange to give those goods and services, and then they would subsequently pay the tax with those coins. And that's pretty much the extent of at least that historical record. But like you said, Marx doesn't really talk about that at all. I think a lot of it he kind of actually just assumes away. Not assumes away. He does kind of think at some point say like, hey, there's the process of how money came to be. There's a whole historical. There are certain historical conditions that led to this point, but we're not really interested in that. We're interested in the kind of the consequences of adopting it.
All right, so first section is the measure of value. The value is measured with prices, but Marx asserts that prices aren't real in a scientific sense. Rather, they're created in the mind of a seller imagining how much money they can get for a product in the market, and then they put a price tag on it, which then Marx calls the ideal price. So you create a commodity, you have this idea that I want to sell it for $5, but then what you actually get for the product in a market setting through exchange is what Marx then calls the real price, which again is dictated by the market, which in a sense is sort of an average price that one can get for the product based on other similar commodities being offered on the market, and is determined by supply and demand. So Marx talks about supply and demand here, and he doesn't necessarily reject it, but at the same time, economists at the time were really focused heavy on the supply and demand and reaching a market equilibrium, like we'll talk about Say's law in a little bit. But I think what Marx ends up doing is taking that and telling and showing these economists, why they're wrong on their own terms.
Right. I think Harvey points out in one of his lectures that Marx kind of starts with accepting the bourgeois economists' notions of supply and demand and equilibrium, and actually starts from the point of equilibrium. Like he says, okay, we're going to assume that the market is in equilibrium. What are the ramifications of that?
And kind of a preview, kind of towards the end of the chapter. In terms of like global exchange and global capitalism, Marx is really kind of taking his analysis from a closed market system, I believe, not necessarily from like what we deal with now with and like international trade and such.
Right. Yeah. No, he does. I don't think like you said, he talks a little bit about world money at the end of this chapter, but the majority of his analysis doesn't really take that into account. So at least right now, so far in chapter 3, he kind of mentions it, but it doesn't play a huge part in the main point of the analysis.
So as we all know from day to day, the price of something can often contradict its actual value. What Marx specifically says in the chapter is, things which in and for themselves are not commodities, such as conscience, honor, etc., can be offered for sale by their holders and thus acquire the form of commodities through their price. Hence, a thing can, formally speaking, have a price without having a value. So for one example, uncultivated land can have a price, but have no value, because according to Marx's labor theory of value, since no human labor has been incorporated into the land, then the amount of socially, and being that the amount of socially necessary labor time determines value, that you could put a price on something, but it doesn't necessarily have value according to his labor theory of value. And you made a mention I saw in your notes about like stock prices, or like what Harvey mentions about brand, recognition.
Yeah. So that's one thing I definitely wanted to talk about. So that whole section, which I think is page 197 of chapter 3, is that qualitative value. What we understand as qualitative value, like things like reputation, honor, essentially like brands. What we would understand if like something has a brand value now actually plays a huge part in price formation. And Harvey makes the reference to stock prices and Apple and stuff like that, like specifically Tesla, right? We see like in the modern world now, Tesla is like has a stock price. I think the last time I looked at it was like somewhere in the 900s or something. But if you actually look at how many cars they're producing and how many cars are actually then being exchanged for money, it's like that price is completely out of whack with how much they're actually producing. I think it was something, I read an article the other day that said that they are technically worth, their stock is worth 9 times more than like, or is worth more than the top 9 automotive producers in the world, like Toyota, Honda, etc., which is insane. You know what I mean? So it kind of shows how prices can be very far from what they, what the actual value of a company, a firm, or a product is. And a lot of it is because of this qualitative or esoteric, ephemeral, actually is probably a better word, notion of a brand. You know what I mean? It's like a more simple example is like, imagine you go to a grocery store. A lot of people have this. I'm sure there's been psychological studies about this. If people walk into a grocery store and see 2 wine bottles and one of them costs $20, the other one costs $10, your brain automatically assumes, kind of unconsciously, like, that $20 bottle, it probably is, it's probably a better bottle. It's probably worth something. That's kind of the value judgments being made just based on the idea that, this thing has a higher price.
Right. And I mean, not to go too much into a tangent of like stocks and financialization, because Marx in Capital Volume 1 is just talking about the production process, not necessarily the financial sector. But we are recording this when there's just been this GameStop stock price surge. And it's kind of, unmasking the whole idea that, the stock price doesn't necessarily represent the actual value of a company. So like you're saying, Apple or Tesla are another great examples.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that's I mean, that is like kind of like a whole complicated kind of scenario about the hedge funds like kind of shorting stocks and then people catching on to that. But it kind of just shows that it's all gamified. It's not no pun intended, but it's completely arbitrary and not really tied to real what I would call wealth creation or actual. Nobody's actually, GameStop would be worth $300 something. Well, now I think it's worth $100, but whereas the point there was worth $300 something. But it's not like GameStop was employing more people or producing more games or opening up more stores. It had nothing to do with that. It was just like, somebody just saw this kind of shorting activity going on, and then just decided to act against that. But going back to our example, it's just all based off. These are basically inflations in price of something purely based off reputations more.
Right. So then, prices then need to be able to deviate from their value in order to reach the supply and demand equilibrium. Because obviously, if you were exchanging everything for its exact worth, then there'd be no, gain in value, fluctuation in the supply and demand. But the money commodity can also fluctuate, at least in terms of when it's like based in like the gold standard or something, because during Marx's time, there was this gold rush in America, and this increase of gold being discovered obviously deflated its value, while then a decrease in gold will inflate its value. But it doesn't necessarily have an effect on the value itself of the commodities. So, for example, let's say you buy a skateboard, using the example of gold, let's say a skateboard is worth 1 gold coin and a bike is worth 2 gold coins, but then the skateboard's price doubles to 2 gold coins and the bike doubles then to 4 gold coins. The bike is still worth twice as much as what the skateboard is worth. So the amount then of which a commodity is worth is what Marx calls the price form, and which is, of course, its exchange value as realized through its labor, through his whole labor theory of value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I said, this is kind of, obviously, like we talked about in the first video, he's a medalist, he's basing a lot of this stuff talking about gold, but, I'm no monetary economist, and I don't know the ins and outs of actual monetary theory, but I would assume similar, this kind of principle must be at play with the same idea of like when people say, oh, the dollar is worth this amount, right? But I guess it's, instead of being related to gold, it's just related to other currencies in the sense of like $1 is worth, or €1 is worth $2, or $1 is worth 100 Mexican pesos, or whatever the actual exchange rate is.
Right.
But I would assume these kind of principles will work in the same kind of manner. Is that the fluctuations in that the values of the things don't change. It's just the amount of dollars you have to pay for it change.
Right. So I mean, I guess that kind of wraps up the first section as far as like money as a measure of value. I guess the key takeaways would be that there's an ideal price, which is imagined by the seller, and then there's the real price, which is then actually materialized in the exchange process.
Right. And I would add to that, I would add 2 things. One is to keep in mind that whole idea of the real actual measure of value happens after exchange. You know what I mean? The idea, like you could be trying to sell your T-shirts and you can attach a price to it, and it could be your ideal price. But until you actually exchange it and somebody gives you money for it, you don't know if that thing was actually worth anything.
Right.
So that's definitely very, very important to keep in mind.
Right. And one last thing I'll say just about this chapter in general, and kind of about a little bit about the last chapter also, is a lot of this stuff, more of this chapter, a lot of this stuff kind of seems obvious in a way, because obviously people imagine they're going to get something for an item or product they create, and then, depending on supply and demand, and really just the demand for it, determines how much they actually get for it. It seems kind of obvious, but Marx kind of just breaks it down with all these terms?
Yeah, I think that like with a lot of any kind of, I think when you start to try to theorize, I think a lot of the beginnings of your theory making have to kind of start with really just defining a lot of things and like
Right.
really laying it out so that everybody who you're trying to convince of your hypothesis is fully aware of like, okay, the same way like you do a scientific study, you outline your methodology, like, hey, this is this is my hypothesis, and then there's a section in your scientific paper where it's like, this is my methodology, this is how I actually came to my conclusions. And I think this is essentially that. This is Marx outlining the methodology of how he's going to get to his conclusions at the end of the book about class struggle and the rest of it. So it's a necessary evil in a way.
So moving on. Section 2 then covers the means of exchange and money as the means of exchange. So as we already know, value changes its appearance through the process of exchange through this universal equivalent called money. And what he first calls the CMC relation, which means a commodity transforming then into money and then money back into a commodity. So commodity to money, C to M would be selling, M to C would be buying. And then of course, it's always easier to go from the universal equivalent money to a commodity rather than vice versa, because the universal equivalent can be used to buy any commodity really. So then this is where Marx then criticizes Say's law. I'll let you take what Say's law outlines.
Yeah. So basically, the Say's law was that for everything you sell, essentially, somebody's buying it. So the idea there is that everything that basically proves that there's no overproduction, because if you're selling something, somebody buys it, there's an equilibrium, automatic equilibrium happening. And this gets immediately criticized by Marx on page 201 because of basically says here that money, however, is in someone else's pocket. To allow it to be drawn out, the commodity produced by its owner's labor must, above all else, be a use value for the owner of the money. In order for somebody to get money, number one, somebody has to want, need, or desire it, right? Desire the labor or the commodity you're bringing into the market. And this causes, and basically Marx totally shoots this down by saying, well, just because you can't automatically assume that somebody is going to buy something. You know what I mean? Somebody could hold on to that money and not bring it to market and not exchange it for other commodities.
Hoarding it.
Or hoarding it, essentially, yeah, which he goes into later in the book, or later in the chapter. And later on, in history, John Maynard Keynes builds upon this idea with his idea of liquidity preference. The whole idea of which has built his whole theory about the Great Depression, was basically a lot of it was caused because people feared market conditions and therefore held on to money because they were afraid of losing it, therefore completely contradicting Say's law. But before we continue, I just want to kind of like pause a second and talk about the CMC commodity circuit, because I think this is really, really critical. One, because it kind of starts this kind of abstraction that he makes. The CMC kind of shows our mutual dependence on each other. That's kind of one thing, is that we're all this. I kind of feel like this idea is expressing that we're all selling something, whether it's like an actual product or labor that we're bringing to a market. All of us, in order to get this universal equivalent money in the middle, and then we're subsequently actually exchanging that for the things that we actually need, like shelter and food and water and etc. But we're all mutually dependent on each other, which I think is really the crux of that abstraction. And then the second thing is that this kind of starts to set the seeds of where crisis can come out of. Like this, once you kind of understand that, this is how commodities exchange, you can kind of start to see, well, what happens if somebody can't, translate their commodity or their labor into money,
Right. And really quick on that point, like at the time, a lot of people accepted Say's law as truth, and I know there's a lot of neoclassical economists that kind of accept it today. And both back then and today, economists on both sides assert that these crises in capitalism, just economic crises, wouldn't occur, if the economy were to perform, exactly according to their textbooks or their theories, which is just, very wishful thinking that an economy is ever going to be like perfectly set to like in equilibrium. So that made me think of something that Keen said in a lecture video that we saw, where his quote was, "Economists are more committed to their core question and their answers to it than to what the economy actually does. They don't see the economy, they see their model." So it's this kind of narrow-minded view, I think, in just the field of economics. I mean, neither of us are economists, but that's from an outsider perspective. I mean, if you're only viewing things from a certain way, then if it doesn't work out that way, then there has to be a problem, right?
Right. Yeah. I think Keene kind of heavily criticizes that, just on the basis of like they're trying to always fit reality into their model instead of trying to modify their models to account for what's going on in reality. It's kind of
right.
Ass backwards, so to speak.
Right.
It suffers. I think the discipline suffers from that tremendously, and that's why it's exciting when you see these, which we're going to read about later on. But people like Stephanie Kelton and Mazzucato and others with donut economics and stuff like that are presenting these different models that are that essentially presenting economics as really a dynamic studies rather than studying static systems.
Right.
But I wanted to ask you about something, because I was thinking about this whole idea about CMC, the CMC concept, and I was kind of thinking like, if we're all, how do we know that what we're doing is useful? You know what I mean? Like, especially like when you're growing up and you're going to high school, at least my experience was my guidance counselors, didn't really, they pretty much didn't provide me any guidance. And I started to think about like how, I just feel like it's so haphazard the way that we kind of organize the society, and that we're leaving it up to 18-year-old kids to kind of decide for themselves, like what they should learn or what they should make, and then hope for the best that it'll somebody out there in the marketplace will buy what we're trying to sell, or buy what our labor, because hopefully we study something useful. Right. And I was kind of thinking about this, like, wouldn't it be better in a sense to plan that out? And this, the kind of idea I had in my head was, to actually put these guidance counselors to use, maybe they should be getting state or local data, like local like employment data, and they should see like, oh hey, like from, let's say you started in 2010 in high school, they would get, in the next 4 years we're gonna need X amount of plumbers, X amount of programmers, X amount of electricians, X amount of HVAC technicians, X amount of mechanics, whatever it is, right? Whatever the shortages are, and then you could just tell these kids like, hey, we need X, this is what's going to be needed in the next 4 years, and then maybe set up training programs in the freaking 4 years that you're in high school to actually like give you a skill set that is going to put food on your table, rather than just haphazardly throwing you into the fucking economy.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that makes me think of is something we kind of talked about in the last chapters, is like when Marx talks about socially necessary labor time, it's like, who determines, what is socially necessary? The only thing that comes to mind when we talk about planning, and that comes to a lot of people's minds, is like the Soviet Union and Cuba and all these countries. They ended up having these government committees, or like the Vanguard experiment in the Soviet Union, where there's like a small committee of central planners, planning the economy. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the balance that I think any government needs to find, is between freedom of like, oh, if a kid wants to take the risk of being an actor or an artist or whatever, and then go into that. But at the same time, I think it'd definitely be helpful as far as like laying out like or incentivizing even, we need, people to work in the green tech industry or something like that. And like, I don't know if then there'd be a way to not fully plan the economy, but at the same time, incentivize like a job program for that. And I mean, if now talking about like modern day, I mean, that's kind of like what the idea behind like the Green New Deal is transitioning into green energy, but incentivizing green energy with like a job program or like a federal job guarantee. So no, definitely there's definitely something there as far as like laying out, what's actually needed in the economy and, somehow incentivizing that for 18-year-olds who are just like lost or coming out of high school and like don't know what to do with their lives, right?
Yeah, I wanted to bring it up just because I just feel, at least in my own experience, I didn't know what the hell I really wanted to do when I was 18. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I read a couple, grew up reading National Geographic, and I was like, yeah, sure, anthropology sounds sweet, but you know what I mean? Like, that had no concept, and I just feel like that's what's happened to a lot of kids.
Right.
And later on, I had to like teach myself programming to get it, to actually put food on the table. And I just feel like, high school could be, education in general could be better planned so that it gives kids in high school an actual skill set that's employable. But then at the end of it, you could still, like, if you decide like, I still want to go be an artist or whatever, or be an actor, which we definitely need. Like, I'm not trying to like just say we're all going to, have this technocracy that we're all just
right.
technicians. But I feel like I need some sort of skill set you need to fall back on. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think what Marx sets up here in the commodity circuit is kind of the setting the seeds again of the prices of realization. Like, you're putting people through these training programs, but without any guarantee of it actually is going to actually realize anything. You're going to be able to exchange it for anything. And I think it's inefficient. I think it's inefficient.
Yeah. And last point on that is just as far as like, obviously the whole education system needs restructuring and like less standardization, and then just making higher education more accessible would help with that. Cause like you take out loans and you spend 4 years learning about anthropology, or for like my first 2 years of college, I was, pursuing a theater degree. And then like halfway through, I'm like, oh wait, realistically, what am I going to do with a theater degree? So yeah, I think definitely making higher education more accessible would definitely help with that also, because then people don't have to spend, thousands of dollars and take out loans for thousands of dollars to just have a degree that ends up being, useless.
And to our audience, there was a point to this whole tirade was the idea of we're trying to bring Marx's idea to modern day, right? We're trying to say like, okay, understanding this commodity circuit, what are the repercussions of that? That's why I brought up this whole thing. It's like, well, yeah, the problem of realization, being able to change your labor for something, maybe there's a way, by understanding that this is a way we can figure out societal problems. But yeah, getting back to the text.
To chapter 3, section 2, means of exchange, which we're still on. So yeah, first he was talking about the commodity circuit, which is CMC. And then he kind of lays out then how money actually circulates, which is kind of the opposite, which is MCM. So it goes from money to a commodity and then back to money. And then from that, he kind of plunges into, I guess, for lack of a better word, a little kind of like a boring analysis of the circulation of money, which basically lays out something called the quantity theory of money, which as an equation would be M equals P times Q divided by V, which is money is equal to prices times the quantity divided by velocity. I just wanted to say one quick passage from Keynes' Companion which ends up after this whole section of talking about the quantity theory of money and everything. He kind of arrives at a supposed law or a conclusion, being that the quantity of the circulating medium is determined by the sum of the prices of the commodities in circulation and the average velocity of the circulation of money. So that is, the velocity of circulation of money is simply a measure of the rate at which money circulates, e.g. how many times in a day a dollar bill changes hands. Do you want to get more into that? I know, and this is one of the sections where Harvey talks about, and everybody who's really like a scholar on Marx talks about, like a lot of people just end up like throwing the book out the window because they're, I was promised these revolutionary ideas, like why am I like doing this math now, right? So last thing I'll say before I hand it over to you, that classical economists thought money determines prices, while Marx then believes prices were at the equilibrium point determined by, again, his famous socially necessary labor time. That socially necessary labor time helps bring prices at equilibrium.
Okay, so yeah, like the reason why the whole velocity of money point I think is important is it ties into that idea of hoarding. Because as people hoard money, they're literally breaking that commodity circuit. and they're reducing the amount of times that money exchanges through people's pockets. And therefore, if money doesn't translate from the owners of money to the people that don't have money, then the people that don't have money can't purchase commodities that they need to live and survive. And that's kind of how that whole thing ties together. But I think there's a really important other point here that another kind of unknown economist, Silvio Giselle, points out, is that the fact that money can be hoarded, because he kind of, I think he was originally from Argentina. I think he was a German, but he lived in Argentina. But he experienced a monetary crisis there, and his whole idea was that money doesn't spoil. And the fact that it doesn't spoil like other commodities, like if you have a bunch of bread inside of your grain house, eventually that thing is going to spoil and rot and something, and that kind of influences you to bring it to market and sell it. But people that have money don't have that kind of impetus to get rid of it, and that kind of property that money has allows it to be hoarded and reduces the velocity. So his kind of ingenious idea that I think definitely will need to be explored later on at some point is this idea that money should have like a carrying capacity to it. Like after a certain amount of time, that money will start to reduce in value, and forcing you, kind of encouraging people to spend it rather than hoard it, thus preserving the commodity circuit and preserving the velocity of money, which I've always kind of been very fascinated by, that whole idea. But yeah, that's one thing I just wanted to mention, that
Right.
that's something I got out of that whole kind of really boring section about when he starts talking about velocity of money and crap like that. It kind of reminded me of Silvio Giselle.
Yeah, and he was German Argentinian, but he lived and died in Germany, which I guess at the time was Prussia.
Got it.
But yeah, so with regards to hoarding, that kind of leads us then perfectly into section 3, money, where he kind of brings the ideas together, and he talks a lot about hoarding. So to recap really quick, we've talked about section 1 as a measure of value, in which there's an ideal price and a real price, and then section 2, money as a measure of exchange, where people exchange a commodity for money, and then money for a commodity, selling, buying. So then Marx brings it all together in section 3. So even though money plays these multiple contradictory roles, there is only one money at the end of the day. And he talks, like we've been talking about people hoarding money. The reason being is because, for one, there's power in money and having a lot of money, and it's also at the same time socially necessary. So, for example, you get paid, but you have rent due the next month, so you need to hold on to that money and build it up in order to then pay your rent, or also putting a down payment on a house. You need to save up a few $1,000s to put a down payment on a mortgage. So there's that power in money, and being both that it brings you power and it's socially necessary. What Marx then says is money is also itself a commodity, an external object capable of becoming the private property of any individual. Thus, the social power becomes the private power of private persons. And before we get too far into that, he talks about money as a means of payment. So if you don't have the money at the moment, then you need it. You can always pay later, which then leads to the concept of credit. So the seller then becomes a creditor and a buyer becomes a debtor. And the creditor is only going to provide money if they're going to get something in return. It's not just going to be an equal exchange, right? They're going to want the promise or the IOU that they're going to get more money in exchange at a later date by lending somebody money, which then leads to this concept of interest, which is essentially then selling money for more money rather than selling money for commodities. So then the crucial point in all this is where the concept of capital emerges through exchange, because money is not necessarily capital if it's used to buy more like commodities. Money is only capital if it's used to get more money. So he's describing the way in which private individuals can appropriate this universal equivalent of money for their own private purposes. And then we begin to see the possibility for, concentration of private and class power in this monetary form, which are then essentially the foundations of capitalism. Yes?
Yeah, definitely. I think this part of the book, this part of the chapter is probably my favorite part of the chapter, because this is when he actually starts kind of like you said, bringing together a lot of these concepts, even from the previous two chapters. His whole fetishism. He starts talking about the fetishism of the money form, and how it acquires this power because of its role as a universal equivalent. And he continues to kind of expand on this idea that the holders of money have tremendous amount of power, and they can use it to manipulate the social order. He talks about, specifically, there's a page 230, the hoarding drive is boundless in its nature. Money is independent of all limits. It is the universal representative of material wealth because it is directly convertible into any other commodity. So that again goes back to my whole idea of like the fact that money has this crazy special quality that it just never decays and you can just hold on to it forever. So if you have vast amounts, and the fact that it has the property that it can be exchanged for anything, it has a tremendous amount of power, and the people that then have a lot of it have a tremendous amount of power. So it comes back, I like that he ties up all these different concepts that he's been building for the last 3 chapters, and also once again to emphasize the social relations that are created as a consequence of organizing in a society built upon commodity production. And I thought it was interesting too that he even mentions how ancient societies kind of recognized this very, very early on, about basically the power of money and how they very pretty much understood that this power needs to be controlled somehow. So a lot of early religions obviously demonized greed and called it a sin, and had all of these. This is encoded in like every major religion.
Right. He talks about how I don't know if it was the Catholic Church or I don't know what religion it was. Oh, I think it's Islam even to this day, like is kind of against this concept of interest. And I think at one point maybe even the Catholic Church had some laws forbidding interest, right?
Yeah, definitely. There's been that's been a very like I said, encoded in a lot of major religions. Specifically, what you're mentioning is the practice of usury. The idea of getting interest was essentially outlawed. And yeah, I just thought that was very interesting. And then obviously, with the point you just brought out, basically creating this new dichotomy of creditor and debtor. Which is the new. We went from buyers and sellers to now creditors and debtors. This new social relation that we are exploring, and that has tremendous ramifications because of money being starting to use as a means of payment. The idea that you can take a commodity like a house and not immediately exchange it for money and commodities. So you're basically the guy who owns the house is selling it to you, and he's realizing the M part of the equation slowly over time. So he's slowly getting the money, and you are slowly getting the other side of it, eventually being able to own the house. But it's delayed, and that delay creates this what you pointed out, the idea of credit money and the idea of IOUs and the idea of debts, and Marx starts talking about how this was the foundation of the class struggle. This was the beginning, like even since ancient societies, where this was usually the foundation of a lot of rebellions, peasant rebellions, is because the peasants were in debt to their feudal lords, and then every once in a while these debts would become so egregious that they would start cutting people's heads off because they couldn't pay off their debts anymore. So
there's also the whole social power behind money. Kind of there's this whole trope that rich people are extra stingy with their money, right? Like they end up being cheaper because they're like so addicted to like holding on to all this money. That's just a trope that I hear a lot. Is there any last bits before I just give a quick recap of chapter 3 that you wanted to mention?
No, I think that's pretty much it. One final thing I guess I want to say is that the whole idea of basically we're all forced to accumulate money in some way, because no matter if you're an actual mega capitalist, or if you're just like you and me who have to pay the rent in our 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, like we're forced to hold on to money for a certain amount of time, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be able to make rent and be able to pay our groceries and stuff like that. So again, this is just I just want to hammer home the point that we're all subject to the laws of commodity production and the ramifications, because we've chosen to, organize our societies around independent commodity producers. We're all independent, and we're all selling either our wares or our labor, all hoping to get enough money to scrounge together to pay for the necessities of life. And it puts us at odds with each other a lot of the time, which I think is, again, one of the main cruxes of Marx's ideas, is that unfortunately capitalism pits us against each other more often than not.
All right. I think that's a great place to end, but since I mentioned that I was going to recap, I'll just recap really quick. So just to recap, Marx talks about money in chapter 3, money playing two roles: as a measure of value, in which there's an ideal price and a real price; as a measure of exchange, where people exchange a commodity for money and then money for a commodity, selling and buying; and finally in section 3, where he brings it all together, where he talks a lot about people hoarding money because of its social necessity and or giving them power. So join us in our next video, where we'll talk about part 2, the transformation of money into capital. We'll go through chapters 4 through 6, and join us then.
Take it easy.